Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Informal History podcast. I'm Liz Wolfson. I'm a writer, educator, and curator based here in St. Louis, and a co-host and editor of the Informal History podcast and zine. Today we have an interview with Professor George Lipsitz. Professor Lipsitz is Professor of Black Studies and Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is the author of over half a dozen books and numerous articles, many of which are focused on St. Louis, where Lipsitz lived and worked as a student, activist, community organizer, and scholar throughout the 1960s and 1970s. In this interview, we talk about many of his experiences in St. Louis during that period, as well as his deep knowledge of St. Louis's history and the ways in which the legacies of race, racism, and racialized urban policy have shaped the city's built and social environment. And now, my interview with Professor George Lipsitz. So, to start, I was hoping that you could take us back to 1965, when I believe you first arrived in St. Louis. And maybe if you could just talk about some of your, first impressions of the city, what WashU was like at that time when you arrived, and how you became involved in some of the movements that you became active in.
I first came to St. Louis in the summer of 1963. I was a high school student, finishing my junior year in high school, going to the American Freedom Summer Institute, which was a program for high school students run by the Danforth Foundation at Washington University, and included lectures from Washington University professors and classes with area high school teachers. And I was able to meet young people from around the country who were studying American government, politics, and the idea of freedom. One of the early things that they did with that program was take us on a tour of the city. And they took us to the north side. They took us past Pruitt-Igoe. They took us to places that they wanted to show as negative object lessons, as things that weren't working. But to me, they resembled neighborhoods in Paterson, New Jersey, the city where I was from and where I grew up, that I knew were a mixed bag, that they were, of course, sites of great deprivation and repression and oppression, police brutality, slumlords exploiting the residents. But there were also sites of dynamic cultural and political mobilization. Within Paterson at that time, racial tensions were increasing. A local group of the Congress of Racial Equality had a campaign against slumlords and against what they called bar checks, police running into bars and charging that people had outstanding warrants, holding guns on them as a way to terrorize the community. And I felt that what the Institute had done was kind of position us as white tourists looking at an area that was allegedly primitive that I knew had value above and beyond that. And this was my first introduction to St. Louis. It was new. It was the first day I set foot in the city, but it was immediately familiar to me in many ways because of the racial dynamics that I saw there. That summer was when Medgar Evers was killed. It was right after the mass demonstrations in Birmingham and the terrible brutality unleashed by Bull Connor and the police and fire departments in Birmingham. It was the summer that people were organizing the March on Washington movement, a summer where Dr. King led a fair housing march in Detroit. And so the issues of class, race, privilege, power were very much in our minds. But I had very little contact outside of Washington University at that time. And I was later to find that when you cross Skinker Boulevard, you've gone a long distance, that there are many things to the west of Skinker Boulevard that have no knowledge of what exists to the east. The next summer, I came to enroll as a freshman at Washington University. 3 weeks before I came to St. Louis, there was an insurrection in the city of Paterson, where I grew up. Police brutality had wedged in some Black teenagers coming back from a dance onto the sidewalk. They fought back to defend themselves. The community was so outraged by the police behavior and by a pent-up list of grievances about the police that they broke store windows, set fire to some establishments, and were met, of course, with massive violence by the city police. And so I left 3 weeks after that and found myself in St. Louis as an incoming freshman, and a group of politically conscious people organized around the campus YMCA, where a man named David Fink was in charge of social programs. Fink had been an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the South. In his network were the sisters Joyce and Dory Ladner, who were coming. Joyce was coming to study sociology at Washington University. Joyce and Dory Ladner had been the most courageous opponents of white supremacy in Southwest Mississippi, where they grew up. And they were there to teach us about things. And through their contacts, we got in touch with the part of the Congress of Racial Equality chapter in St. Louis. Percy Green, Ivory Perry, Solomon Rooks, a whole group of people who invited us to come to do two things. One, to go door-to-door canvassing in Pruitt-Igoe to register people for that fall's election, and also to go door-to-door canvassing in Kinloch, which was right next to Ferguson, where we got to see conditions in people's houses in an area that had been created by white supremacy. That basically Kinloch existed because the white residents of the city left it to form the then all-white suburb of Berkeley. The citizens of Ferguson prevented traffic going back and forth, even though many residents of Kinloch were workers in Ferguson doing domestic work and childcare, janitorial work. And so I got my first week in St. Louis, I saw Pruitt-Igoe and Kinloch/Ferguson. And this turned out to be a good introduction to what the next 60 years were going to be, both in St. Louis and around the country. The people who took us to Pruitt-Igoe and to Kinloch turned out to be people who I learned a great deal from. They were working class Black men and women who had been involved in the Jefferson Bank protests, who set up a youth center on the corner of Spring and Cottage near the old Bush Stadium on the north side, and who had a number of projects against police brutality, in favor of testing and screening and treatment for lead poisoning, that were a vital part of my education at Washington University. And what I saw over the next 4 years, is, I sometimes describe it this way, I went to classes in history and political science at Washington University, where I was told that the nation had fundamentally solved its problems, but there were no class antagonisms in the United States as there were in Europe. There was no lack of democracy in the United States. The only problems were, how could we get the urban underclass to become more urban and better behaved? And what would we do with all the leisure time and wealth that the society was producing? And as I listened to those lectures during the morning or afternoon, and then in late afternoon and evening, being taken to places on the north side where slumlords gained profits from buildings that had no indoor plumbing, whose electric wiring was dangerous, places where women stayed awake at night with guns to keep rats from gnawing at their babies. The contrast formed an impossible dilemma for me, that what was received expert knowledge in the university contrasted dramatically from what I saw on the other side of Skinker Boulevard, and especially east of Grand and north of Lindell.
I mean, how amazing to, receive these sort of parallel educations, it sounds like. And I can totally imagine, the sort of contradiction that this, would have created, in your young mind. And, you've already mentioned some historic events like the Jefferson Bank, protest, and some other events, and, which, I'm a little bit familiar with, our listeners may have some familiarity with, but I wonder if you could go into a little bit more detail about some of the, events of that period that really stand out in your mind as kind of turning points or, historic moments.
Yeah, the Jefferson Bank demonstrations concern a bank in a Black neighborhood that had Black customers, but no Black tellers, no Black workers at all. And a group of activists protested against that, sought to get jobs at the bank, and had a sit-in. And this was after I had left St. Louis and gone back to Patterson. So I was no longer in St. Louis when the demonstration actually happened, but there was a lot of talk about it because a number of activists at Washington University, Jimmy Rollins and others, were in touch with it, and they were able to educate us about what was happening. There was a sit-in at the bank, and people were arrested. The prosecutor was related to the family that owned the bank. The people who sat in included Bill Clay, who later became congressman, at that time was an alderman, Bob Curtis, who was chair of the Corps, whose mother ran the People's Arts Center in North St. Louis, a number of white and Black members of Corps. All of the organizers were basically indicted for the sit-in, even though several of them weren't there. And then, as Solomon Rooks pointed out, they were given sentences that were so long it was as if they had robbed the bank rather than had just tried to sit in the bank. And this was a sign that the St. Louis business class saw no need to have fair hiring. The utilities, Cleve Gas and then Union Electric, that were monopolies that got money by charging Black customers, would not hire Black people to be clerks, to be telephone operators. And they certainly wouldn't hire Black men to be installers and inspectors in St. Louis, because that would put them into white people's houses. And what this meant was that qualified workers were denied jobs because of their race. The city lost the productivity and the contributions that they could make. In addition, segregation, restrictive covenants, and then just outright housing discrimination, which was thoroughly legal. And in many ways, St. Louis was the center of the key cases about housing discrimination. As Walter Johnson has shown in his wonderful new book, The Broken Heart of America, the first ordinance making it illegal to have integrated blocks was passed in St. Louis. The Shelley v. Kramer case that challenged restrictive covenants was in St. Louis. The Jones v. Meyer case, which eventually established that fair housing was the law, was in St. Louis. And so you had people in segregated neighborhoods. The key thing about Jefferson Bank was, first of all, that the community mobilized on its own behalf. The second thing that's important was that the white power structure said, we aren't going to give you anything. And the third thing that happened was that experience turned into a crucible for all the things that Action and other activists were able to do in the years ahead. And as a student, I was living on campus, which is, on the St. Louis-Clayton border, far away from these things. But people would come and talk to us, Ivory Perry and others, explaining what went on, explaining how the police dealt with them. On Saturday mornings, Bernie Hayes and Leon Perry had a radio program on KETZ radio that discussed these issues. And so it was an education for me about the racial order of the society and how it manifested itself in St. Louis, which taught me a lot. In the summer of 1965, after my freshman year at Washington University, there were a series of police killings of unarmed Black teenagers running away from police custody. This also included the murder of one white teenager in South St. Louis, a young man named Timothy Walsh. All of these were essentially executions, and none of them brought justice for the victims. When Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson on August 9th, 2014, I thought, 49 years ago, I saw the same thing played out in St. Louis time after time after time. And I understood what the response would be on both sides. I knew why it would be covered over and why the police would be protected for conduct that is illegitimate. And I also knew why the community would not accept it, as it did not in 1965. In the summer of 1965, Ivory Perry of CORE and Mackler Shepler of the Jefferson Vanderloo Community Corporation organized a march on the mayor's office and the police chief's office to protest these killings. A Black group from the north side went through the streets and picked up demonstrators as they went, and a white group from the south side, friends and relatives of Timothy Walsh, came from the other direction. And they all demanded to see the chief, Curtis Broston. They demanded that the mayor, who by that time was A.J. Cervantes, who had just defeated Raymond Tucker a few months earlier, hear them and attend to their needs. And again, this was a way of mass mobilization, mass education, in which people had to put themselves in the streets, in positions of danger, even to obstruct traffic in order to have their feelings heard, their sentiments heard. 4 months before that, in March, I shouldn't have skipped this, in March of '65, the brutal beatings on the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, led the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to ask people from all around the country to come to join the Selma to Montgomery March so that this brutality would be opposed. St. Louis, in my memory, had the largest number of people coming from compared to any city in the north. And I was one of the people in one of those buses traveling south, being educated by the CORE and SNCC activists who were there. We stopped at the bus station in Birmingham, where we were told by the state troopers under the command of Colonel Al Lingo that we were not welcome. And then we were bused to Montgomery for the last 5 miles of that march, from a place outside of town to the state capitol, past the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King headed the Montgomery bus boycott 10 years earlier, to the state capitol to hear Dr. King tell us that even though the arc of justice was long, in the end, it eventually curved toward justice. He said that underneath the state capitol, where the American flag was flying below the Alabama flag, which had the Confederate flag on it. All of the the National Guardsmen and state troopers from Alabama, who were there supposedly to protect us, but who didn't like us at all, had the flag of the state of Alabama on it with the Confederate flags. And that was an extremely hostile atmosphere. But as we marked through Black neighborhoods and we went past a Black school, which was called the Jefferson Davis Elementary School, Black men and women and children of all ages on the steps shouted out encouragement to us. And so this was a formative crucible in which what was happening in the South and what's happening in the North was related. And remember, I became alerted to what CORE was doing in the North by people like Joyce and Dory Ladner and David Fink, who were bringing the experiences they had had in Freedom Summer in Mississippi in the summer of '64 in the South. And so there was a North-South combination that basically proved to us what Malcolm X told us, and that is that the North and the South are not that different. And Malcolm used to say, if you're south of the Canadian border, you're in the South.
You know, a question that I actually had in my mind that I didn't write down, but now I'm wondering what your response would be. You know, a question that is often debated here in St. Louis is, you know, whether St. Louis is the northernmost southern city or is it the easternmost Midwestern city? And I just wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, somebody once joked that St. Louis was a city with northern charm and southern efficiency. I think that's, maybe that's where those two things met.
Yeah.
People have made a lot of St. Louis's position on the South. Missouri, after all, was a slave state. As Walter Johnson points out, that in some ways it was even more brutal to free blacks than some southern and border states were. That it, on the other hand, it was a site of immigration from Germany. There were many German liberals who supported the Union. They later supported the Magón brothers, who formed the Liberal Party of Mexico in a place not too far from St. Louis University, and started their journal Regeneración, which was part of the progressive part of the Mexican Revolution. So it's a mixed circumstance. Walter Johnson points out that many of those Germans who were against slavery were not in favor of blacks, and so and in many ways they thought slavery was an obstacle to an empire in the West that they wanted to take from indigenous people. So it's the West is also, it's not just the North-South that affects St. Louis, it's also the East-West binary. But I've tried to argue for years that so much of what happened in the North was a product of the South, that the upheavals in Detroit in the summer of Newark and Detroit in the summer of 1967 had to do with people from Alabama being forced to find jobs in the North. The Watts Rebellion of 1965 had a lot to do with Black people being pushed out of Louisiana and Texas. In my own city of Paterson, New Jersey, we knew that many of the Black people were there had come since 1940 because of the mechanization of agriculture and the subsidies, really, that the New Deal gave to mechanization that forced people from the Carolinas, from Georgia, from Alabama, to come and be in Paterson. So I really think that the whole question of whether St. Louis is North or South depends on a wrong assumption that the North is not racist and the South was racist. Dr. Du Bois, in his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America, said the North is not less racist than the South. It's only a more successfully racist because it can hide its racism without having to resort to Jim Crow segregation and lynching.
Yes, well, thank you for that, for nuancing, our what is often, simplistic assumptions about region, actually, that'll get into a question that I have about your work, sort of more broadly, that we can get to perhaps in a bit. But just going back to your experiences living in St. Louis. So again, you came here to attend WashU as an undergrad, but then you stayed in the city after graduating. And I wonder if you could speak to sort of your thought process and what drove your decision to stay, and what some of your experiences were in the city after graduation.
Yeah, well, I was part of some radical collectives around, initially around the underground newspaper, the St. Louis Outlaw, and later a collective based on working class organizing called On the Line, which put out a newspaper called On the Line. And through those experiences, I became in touch with the rent strike that and the national welfare rights movement mobilizations in St. Louis, which actually won some significant concessions from the federal government, limiting rents in public housing. I was an eyewitness and participant in the struggles led by a Black activist named Ivory Perry and a white social worker named Robert Nickmeyer at the Yeatman Community Center to expose and treat lead poisoning in the Black community. That there was basically an epidemic of lead poisoning, but Black youths were not being tested or treated. The medical establishment ignored this and refused to, said that the people complaining about lead poisoning weren't doctors, didn't have credentials, didn't know what was going on. And what the Coalition Against Lead Poisoning did was get nursing and medical students from St. Louis University to set up centers. Some were at the Yeatman Health Center on the north side, near the old ballpark on Grand and Dodier, but also in places like Maurice's Gold Coast Lounge on Lindell, a tavern across the street from Laclede Town, where a man named Maurice Williamson, who owned the bar, opened it up so that Black kids could be tested for lead poisoning. And they found that there was, in fact, an epidemic. They mobilized, they forced the city of St. Louis to pass the first ordinance, the first municipal ordinance addressing the lead poisoning crisis anywhere in the country. Now, that's been indifferently enforced over the years. In 2006, I came back to St. Louis because the Green Party and environmental groups were still fighting to get that enforced and still fighting to have young people's futures not destroyed by the existence of lead poisoning, which is lead on paint and inside walls is fairly easy to get rid of, but landlords felt it was too expensive. And the city basically judged that the profits of the landlords were more valuable than the lives of Black children. And so it took a constant battle to try to enforce it. But there was that battle, which was very much needed. Those were the years when Pruitt-Igoe was demolished, imploded from within and blown up because neglect, lack of maintenance, physical isolation, police obliviousness to public safety problems made it unlivable. And that meant that thousands of people had nowhere to go. And so they wound up in new overcrowded areas of the North Side and started the movement across the city lines toward the North County, toward Normandy, toward Ferguson. Black students at Normandy High School staged a walkout and protest of what they deemed to be a racist principle. They demanded an education that would be relevant to them and respectful of them. That was the school district that Michael Brown was assigned to 40 years later. So all of these things were important in their own right, but they were seeds for future change. I was also at that moment part of an interracial oppositional caucus in Local 688 of the Teamsters Union called Rank and File Teamsters, where I was able to go into the homes of Black and white workers and be able to see the ways in which spatial differencing between the North and South Side gave them some problems that were similar and some problems that were dissimilar. The raft met in a bar on the Hill, and they picked the Hill because they wanted to have a place where Black workers would be welcome on the South Side. And they tried to be an organization that, very rare in the history of St. Louis, said the same things on the South Side that they said on the North Side, and insisted that the injuries of all workers be addressed. Again, that was a movement surveilled by the Red Squad of the St. Louis Police Department. It was crushed many ways by the Teamsters Union, headed by somebody who had a reputation as a liberal, Harold Gibbons. But it was a very important introduction to me of working class activism. And it was through that I renewed some of the contacts I had earlier with people who were in the Black freedom movement.
Yeah, I was really interested to read about your work with the Teamsters, and because, you know, I think that history of interracial, you know, organizing within the labor movement is, in a lot of ways, you know, not very well known. And
we were told, even by people in the union, that the rank and file are white racist. One liberal union official told to me, these are guys with guns and panel campers. You can't talk to them about social justice. And of course, when we did talk to them and we joined them in caucuses where they worked with Black workers, some of them were white supremacists and were white racists. We ourselves were not innocent of the privileges of whiteness, which had shaped our entire lives. But there were also many moments of interracial solidarity, of working together, of white workers who recognized that anti-Black racism was a way of undercutting worker solidarity, was a way of undercutting wages. They recognized that Black workers were often the most conscious, the most militant, the most willing to fight back. Many of them had been in the military, where they found that Black and white enlisted men could make common cause against officers who were put in a position of sacrificing their lives. And so it was a very mixed experience. But among those leaders, there were white workers who were thoroughly conscious on racial issues, able to work with Blacks, Black workers who welcome white support. And this was a long history in St. Louis. There were, of course, nationalist groups, and they had every right to be nationalist. There's a time where it makes sense for a group to deal with itself. But Percy Green of Action always was willing to work with whites who were able to follow Black leadership, who were able to be grounded in a Black political and intellectual perspective. But there was no sense of whites being unwelcome in the struggle if they really wanted to be in the struggle. They were unwelcome if they wanted to run it, if they wanted to dilute it, if they wanted to betray it. But in St. Louis, we had many examples of interracial solidarity on these issues. Never enough and never, and always precarious, but nonetheless it was there. 1970 was when the Nixon administration funded the so-called Hard Hat March, which was white workers demonstrating against and attacking anti-war demonstrators. There was a similar march like this in St. Louis. We observed it. We found it had no difference on the ground in the many shops where we were represented in terms of Black-white interactions. Some of it was bad, as you would expect, but it certainly was far better than what happened at the Board of Aldermen, what happened at the St. Louis County Council, what happened in Civic Progress, the organization of leaders that was set up to essentially run the city and made of Black neighborhoods sacrifice zones, which to this day are suffering from what they enacted. Whatever violence and brutality white workers might have demonstrated toward Blacks, they couldn't do 1% of the damage that was done to the Black community by the ruling elites of the city, the heads of the major corporations, and even the officers of liberal foundations and development organizations, which basically have again and again created surplus value for whiteness out of Black removal and exclusion.
Yes. So going backwards, just really quickly before we move forwards in time again, going back to those really early experiences you had going door to door in Pruitt-Igoe to register voters, could you reflect a little bit on just what what were your observations in Pruitt-Igoe? I ask because since it was so spectacularly demolished, in the 70s. I think it's become so, iconographic in so many ways. We have all of these stories and ideas about Pruitt-Igoe, but fewer, on the ground recollections and perspectives on what life, was like there. So just some of your memories.
Yeah, well, and my memories ought to be seen in concert with people who were even closer eyewitnesses than me. The film about Pruitt-Igoe has a long set of interviews with Sylvester Brown, journalist and activist in St. Louis, who grew up there, and it speaks to many of the residents who had experiences with it. In the summer of '64, when we were there, it was strange, because here are two white college kids knocking on your door on a Saturday, asking you to register to vote, something that we thought would be great for the people there, but they may have felt they had not gained anything by voting and were unlikely to gain anything by it. People, for the most part, treated us well and courteously when we went door to door. We, of course, didn't know when white people come to the door, that's often the social worker to take your kids away, the bill collector to put you in economic trouble, the probation officer designed to criminalize you. And so we didn't know what sign we were given. And there was some hostility, there was some resentment of us being there. Although again, I have to say, the majority of the people were very courteous and pleasant to us, and there was no difficulty. There were bottles thrown at us when we reached the ground level. On the other hand, we have no idea the purpose behind that. People are living crowded in apartments. You have elevators that don't work. You have stairwells filled with urine because there's no public restroom and because kids can't get to the floor that they're on. You have open exposed hot water pipes that kids burn themselves on. You have a lot of conditions that might make people angry. So we had a slightly mixed experience there. A little later, 6 years later, around 1970, 71, what later became the Black Artist Group, a group of musicians and poets and painters who operated out of the Sheldon Auditorium, which was then on Washington, just west of Grand, had a summer arts program in Pruitt-Igoe. They had classes for children. Some of the protest signs that the rent strike used were made in those classes. The musician Julius Hemphill later told me that as a jazz musician, that summer convinced him that you couldn't just be tooting your horn while all these terrible conditions happened around you, that the art ought to be mobilized for something. And the artists in that group that later became the World Saxophone Quartet, Oliver Lake and Julius Hemphill, David Murray, Hamiet Blewett, the poet Quincy Troop, and Eugene Redmond was there, a theater actor named Vincent Terrell, a painter named Oliver Jackson. Many people who went on to be artists all around the country actually got an important workshop in Pruitt-Igoe during that summer as part of the community. But all of the situations, it's not only that Pruitt-Igoe and the other projects were underfunded and not maintained, it's that constant displacement from the Mill Creek Valley, from Pruitt-Igoe, the evictions that come from a redevelopment of this areas downtown out to the Central West End meant that there was a perpetual housing crisis that only CORE and at some moments the East-West Gateway Council and the War on Poverty were addressing. Pruitt-Igoe's difficulties need to be connected to why wasn't there affordable and safe housing for Black people in St. Louis, and why was the federal government's policies to give extensive loans and support to the white neighborhoods in the southwest part of the city and to the white areas in the Central West End, but almost nothing given to the north side, even though community organizations like the Jeff Vanderloo organizations and what I remember as the 19th Ward were actually doing a lot of work that could have recapitalized the city and saved not only its physical infrastructure, but also done more to nurture the talents, abilities, and life chances of the people living on the north side.
Yeah, and I think this brings us to one of the sort of recurrent or running themes that I observe in your scholarship, which is to think about what you call the racialization of space and the spatialization of race, which is such a succinct way to sort of, I think, summarize a lot of these dynamics that you're speaking of. And I wonder if you could just maybe unpack that phrase a little bit and talk about what that means to you.
Well, what better place to learn that than St. Louis, where a cholera epidemic in the mid-19th century emptied out the Mill Creek Valley, and the railroad tracks were put in there to divide it north and south, and development proceeded along those lines, where for the most part, South St. Louis became white, although there were Black people in Carondelet, there were Black people near McKinley High School. Jojo White grew up on the south side. Josephine Baker lived on the south side. And many whites in the north simply slid out to the North County and filled Ferguson, Florissant, Normandy, all of those many suburbs out there. There's no reason why this would happen except restrictive covenants, mortgage redlining, racialized policing, violent mob attacks against blacks who try to move into neighborhoods that were designated as white, and a whole series of zoning decisions formulated by Harlan Bartholomew and then exported all over the country as a way of making whiteness synonymous with hostile privatism, defensive localism, and hoarding resources, and making blackness synonymous with public space and cumulative vulnerabilities, isolation from transportation and jobs. On a visceral level, we found this out when we crossed some of those lines. There was a demonstration in the early 70s at the Baden Bank where the Service Employees Union was trying to organize the workers. And at that time, Baden was an all-white neighborhood. The bank had a mostly white employment roster, and members of the rank and file Teamsters decided to support them. And so we brought a massive group of workers to picket outside the bank on Friday afternoons. And we had white workers and black workers leaving their jobs and driving far distances to come to the far north of St. Louis to stage an interracial demonstration in favor of 8 white women workers who were trying to join the union. The city was freaked out by this. The banks were freaked out by it. Even the union staging the strike didn't like it, and they all conspired to get a restraining order to prevent this mass of people from being on the north side. It was totally peaceful. It was respectful. We didn't threaten anybody. It was actually kind of celebratory because there were so many of us, but this was considered to be, unacceptable. And you would see, the way things went. Every time there was an election, the ads on the side of the buses that went to South St. Louis would say one thing, and the ones that went to North St. Louis said another thing, even though they were the same candidate. They would address one part of the city differently from the other part. South St. Louis became the breeding ground for the White Citizens Council, for vile forms of white supremacy. James Earl Ray's brother owned a tavern on Arsenal in South St. Louis that was a launching point for white racism and perhaps even for the assassination of Dr. King. And so these things were created not just because people like to be in different places, but once races are relegated to different places, that produces race as a form of identity that becomes the way you recognize who you are, who's included, who's excluded, who's welcome, who's not welcome. And this was all manipulated from the outside, but it became an engine that ran by itself. There were attempts to change it. There were attempts within the Urban League to have blocks in white neighborhood become partners of blocks in black neighborhoods. The great Hetty Epstein for many years directed the Freedom of Residence organization, and now the Equal Housing Opportunity Council fights for this. But fair housing in St. Louis, as everywhere else in the country, was the most difficult civil rights gain to win. As difficult as voting rights and employment and capitalization were, fair housing was the most difficult. And this is why, St. Louis was the site of so many definitive fair housing cases. Buchanan v. Wardley, St. Louis and Baltimore in 1917, Shelley v. Kramer, St. Louis case in 1948, Jones v. Meyer in 1968, Blackjack in 1970. All of these definitive moments in the racialization of space were generated in St. Louis. Now, for me, thanks to Ivory Perry, thanks to Percy Green, thanks to Pearlie Evans, people who were able to teach me what this meant, this was a great education, but it was a dynamic that produced enormous unnecessary pain and antagonism in the city and across the country.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess, I'm curious, when you eventually left St. Louis, I believe in the early 1980s, where were things kind of within this broader kind of scope or sweep of conflict, of activism, of the struggle for equal rights and opportunity. When you left in the early 80s, how had things changed? How were things the same, and where did you kind of see St. Louis versus the city when you first arrived?
Yeah, well, the temporary job that I had as a lecturer at University of Missouri St. Louis was not refunded, so I had to go elsewhere. I went first to Houston and later to Minneapolis, St. Paul for teaching jobs. I would have much preferred to stay in St. Louis, but I was not able to. The last few months I was there, I got a small grant from the Missouri Humanities Commission to do an exhibit on social protest in St. Louis. And we had depictions of the 1937 Emerson sit-down strike. We had depictions of the 1877 general strike. We had depictions of Jefferson Bank and the campaigns against lead poisoning. We had a public forum at St. Louis University because we wanted the city to analyze its past and present. This was in the wake of massive deindustrialization and disinvestment. St. Louis lost 40,000 industrial jobs in the last few years that I was in St. Louis. Whole neighborhoods became abandoned, houses boarded up, brick buildings torn down, the bricks sent to Houston and Dallas and to build new houses. It was the election of 1980 led to the presidency of Ronald Reagan, which produced massive cuts in aid to cities and really an end to a lot of enforcement of civil rights laws. So things were in dire shape, and it was time to get in touch with the past and think about its relevance to the present. At a public session that we had, a man in the back of the room raised his hand and asked to speak, and I let him because he came up and took the microphone from my hand and said, "I'm Ivory Perry. I'm in half of the pictures out there. I want to talk about what I did. I want to talk about why this is important now. A lot of children out there don't know what went on, and if there are any historians here, somebody ought to write a book about this." So Ivory talked, and we talked afterwards, and for the next 6 years, I worked with Ivory to write A Life in the Struggle, Ivory Perry and the Culture of Opposition. I came back to St. Louis many times, 20 times, to interview Ivory. And each time I walked with him to accompany him in the work that he was doing. Stopping people's lights from getting turned off, stopping people from being evicted, having demonstrations against police brutality, reminding people of the lead poisoning problem, which was still severe. At one time at the school stadium on North Kings Highway, he had an Easter egg hunt, which he turned into a Black history lesson, that every Easter egg was in the proximity of a poster of some moment in Black history that Black people had been part of. He had exhibits in schools that I helped him set up. So I actually probably had more on the ground, face-to-face encounter with racial capitalism in St. Louis after I left than I had when I was there. And through Ivory's eyes, I began to see things differently, and I interviewed Percy Green, Maurice Williamson, Pearlie Evans, many people, Mae Brown, many people who had been active. And you saw that basically the age of repudiation was on. The temporary fix that made limited concessions through the anti-poverty program and through civil rights measures, through affirmative action, was now over. And in fact, those small concessions were now to be seen as reverse racism that worked to the disadvantage of whites who were now viewed as the aggrieved group because there were some things they were not getting. And this was totally opposite to the economic and physical and health conditions that were actually there. But the dominant discourse and narrative was such. There was an attempt, of course, to put a few Black faces in high places. In the 90s, Freeman Bosley became mayor. But basically, fundamentally, the grassroots constituency continued to be moved around, displaced, dispossessed, disinherited. And this neglect eventually made things build up and produced what happened in Ferguson, what happened in response to the other killings near and around the area. And these, look to come all out of the blue. A 90-second interaction between Darren Wilson and Michael Brown on Kentfield Drive in 2014 explodes, and it's known all over the world. But that 90 seconds was preceded by 90 years of dispossession, of racialized inequality and injustice that had been consistently persisted. Many people were surprised because St. Louis didn't have a major riot. People thought St. Louis had solved its problems because St. Louis is not a southern city, because repression was so successful or co-optation was so successful against Black leaders. It was presumed that St. Louis had solved its problems. I don't know anybody that I ran into on the ground at the grassroots who felt the problems had been solved. That was a product of the discourse and the boosterism of the dominant groups.
So this leads me to maybe a final couple of questions dealing with some of these topics. But before I ask those, I am very curious to know, with that exhibition that you organized at St. Louis University, what happened to those materials? Are they archived? Do you still have them?
Yeah, the materials, I think, disappeared. I think we were trying to set up a St. Louis oral history project at UMSL. And when that was not funded and my job was not funded, it disappeared. I don't know what happened to the photos or to the text. I don't think that the symposia that we had were recorded. We had a great talk by Robert Logsdon, who came out of the United Electrical Workers, by Robert Tibbs, who was part of it became the Oil, Gas, and Atomic Workers, but they were the Laclede Glass employees. Ina Boone of the NAACP gave one of the talks. We had it, the great Ora Malone of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers gave statements, but I think that's all disappeared. I think it's only in popular memory that this exists. Some of the pictures of Ivory are in my book, A Life in the Struggle, and some of the others are probably available at either the Western Manuscripts collection at UMSL, which I think now has the St. Louis Mercantile Library's collection, but it was in that collection. Those photographs may still be there, but I don't think they're organized along the lines that we had them. We also had some amazing images of lithographs from the 1870s about the 1877 strike, and I don't know if those are available either.
Well, perhaps in the future, I would love to talk with you more about this exhibition and possibly recreating it, and expanding it, because I actually am a co-director of a nonprofit gallery here in St. Louis. So
well, I think that there was Die Hard 1 and Die Hard 2, Rocky 1, Rocky 2. I think that often the remakes are better than the original. So let's try it.
Yeah, it sounds great. So I wanted to ask you about the relationship between the practice of history, the writing of history, the teaching of history, and activism. And how you see these two practices relating to one another, how they've played out in your own experience.
Yeah, well, I respect all forms of knowledge. And so I think that as much as the archives are structured in dominance, as much as is the silence, they have silences and omissions, I think you still have to work within them and try to derive the valuable knowledge that can be there. Often you have to read it against the grain, but the archives often enable you to see things from far away, but they also need to be seen from close up. There are alternative archives of memory, often that can only be accessed either through oral history interviews or through examination of material culture, of songs, of paintings, of traditions, jokes that people tell, stories that exist within families. And I think both kinds of archives are important. The problem in our society is that archival evidence, as it's examined by historians, is given respect, and the popular memory is condemned as unreliable and anecdotal. Alessandro Portelli, the Italian historian who wrote The Death of Luigi Trastulli and Other Stories, offers the best counter to this, his argument that both the official and alternative archives have flaws in them, and you have to be a critical reader of either one, but you also have to constantly produce new archives through the kind of curatorial work and collecting work that you and I have done. The illustrative anecdote I often use about this is one of the first interviews I did with Ivory, he told me that he was in the 24th Infantry Regiment during the Korean War, and that it was an all-Black regiment. I thought that must be wrong, because having been trained as a historian and having a PhD in history, I know that Truman's executive order desegregating the Army was in 1948. So by 1940, I assumed the Army could not have been segregated. What I found out was that Ivory's experience led me to discover that there was massive resistance to Truman's order, just as there was massive resistance to Brown v. Board, and that the Army only desegregated when white troops were devastated in the early months of the Korean War, and they needed disposable bodies. And therefore, they allowed previously separate Black troops under white commanders to go to the front lines. But really, throughout the entire Korean War, the Army was integrated, but none of its units were. There were Blacks and whites in the Army, but they were not desegregated. And Ivory's all-Black regiment was basically sacrificed on the front lines and told, you hold off these 3 million Chinese until we can get enough whites well enough armed and safe enough to come and fight them. And the slaughter that Ivory experienced after the Army had been desegregated turned out to be a good lesson for me in thinking about school desegregation or employment desegregation or other forms of desegregation that were not integration, that basically were token and symbolic. The official record that I thought I knew from getting a PhD at the University of Wisconsin turned out to be wrong. Ivory's firsthand experience not only turned out to be right factually, but it contained the seeds of an analytic framework that showed the limits of the categories that I had been trained in at the university.
Very illustrative of those gaps, between official record and actual practice, and rhetoric versus practice.
Yeah, and we need it all. History, we have a infinitesimally small thread of little pieces of evidence to recreate an enormously complex reality. And it's always going to be incomplete. It's always fragmented. It always requires reasoned speculation. Each historical interpretation begs for more evidence and more archives.
Well, perhaps in closing, I would be curious to know if you were to put together a St. Louis syllabus, what, books, articles, films, novels, images, what would Professor Lipsitz put on a St. Louis syllabus?
This is a wonderful question, because if you had asked me this the day I came to St. Louis, or you had asked me this when I left in 1982, I would have had very little to tell you. Now, because of Walter Johnson's Broken Heart of America, the historical work of Clarence Lang, Keona Irvin, Priscilla Dowden, Sundiata Cha-Ja, we have a great efflorescence of historical books that we could look at and see. There are online videos of Percy Green, of Ivory Perry. There's the creative work of Tef Poe and so many of the rappers who were operating in St. Louis. There are the walls with murals on them, the whole collection at Washington University that came out of the Ferguson Uprising, our valuable archives. But it's still true, as Bob Marley used to say, all that glitters is not gold, and half the story has never been told. That basically there's still so much more to be found and to be gotten. It's useful to look at these things. The Pruitt-Igoe film has a lot I don't agree with all of its point of view, but it has a lot of great footage and evidence in it. the film A Strong Seed Planted that was done about the civil rights movement in St. Louis, very valuable. St. Louis has been a centerpiece of fiction by all kinds of writers that is thinly veiled fiction, everybody from Ntozake Shange to Quincy Troop to Dick Gregory's memoir, a whole series of things that have come out of there. But I always say, and I would make up a syllabus as you want, and I would have reading assignments, and I would show films, and I would play music, and I would play everything from ragtime to the blues, and nothing better to me than, Chuck Berry playing Boogie Woogie. I mean, I would do all of that, but I would also tell students to take their shoes off, put the shoes on the desk, and figure out where they could walk in the city to see for themselves the history that's there. It's there in the brick and terracotta buildings. It's there in some of the hodgepodge of statues and monuments that are left there, some of which are monuments to white supremacy and racism. It's there in the contours of neighborhoods, in the where the streets go between Ferguson and Southeast Ferguson or not. It's there in the ways in which the highways bisect neighborhoods. People learn best what they see for themselves. We can give them all the syllabi, all the readings, all the films, but there's no substitute for taking to the streets, listening to whoever talks, talking to whoever listens, and trying to see what the burdens of history are for us. What are the lessons we can learn? What are the great treasures we've gotten for it? But what are the unmet needs, unsolved problems, and urgent moral obligations that we have as a result of the past? I've never felt that the past is over, back there waiting to be discovered. To me, the past is always conditioning the problems and possibilities of the present. Part of what things are and part of what they will be is how they came to be, and that's why history matters.
Well, Professor Lipsitz, George, thank you so much. I can't think of a better place to end our conversation today. It's been, again, such a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for taking the time. And I look forward to continuing being in touch to talk about that exhibition.
It always warms my heart to talk about St. Louis. I've lived other places, but there's a glow that I have, a commitment, a joy in talking about these things, as harsh as some of them are. There's nothing I'd rather do, and so I'm always ready for more.
Wonderful. Well, and I hope that also perhaps we can bring you back sometime soon to walk the streets together, as you say.
Let's do it.
Wonderful. Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.